Right. Let's unpack this. The numbers, they are truly staggering. Trillions upon trillions in debt.
Mm.
And it's accumulating at an alarming, almost dizzying rate. We're talking about global debt here, and it's making headlines for a reason.
It certainly is.
And many experts are now asking the pivotal question, are we genuinely on the brink of, a major financial crisis? Or is this a manageable challenge that the global economy can navigate?
That really is the core dilemma, isn't it?
It feels like it. That's what we're diving into today.
And I think what's crucial to understand from the outset is how pervasive this really is. Global debt, it's not just some abstract figure economist debate somewhere.
Right, not just academic.
Not at all. It directly impacts your wallet, your future, and the very stability of the global economy.
So when we say global debt, what exactly are we covering?
Well, we're casting a very wide net. It basically encompasses three massive interconnected categories. First, you have public debt or government debt. That's the money national governments owe. Washington, D.C., Tokyo, London, you name it. They owe it to creditors, individuals, institutions, even other countries.
Got it.
Second, there's corporate debt. That's borrowing by companies. Could be your local bakery, could be huge multinational giants.
Right, borrowing to expand or...
Exactly. Expand, innovate, sometimes just manage cash flow. And then finally, there's household debt.
The one we feel most directly, probably.
Very likely. That's the money individuals like you and me owe. Think mortgages on homes, credit card balances, and increasingly, the significant burden of student loans. And each one of these categories has just swelled to, well, unprecedented levels. It creates this complex web of financial obligations that are now, collectively, a huge source of global concern.
And it really feels like this isn't just an academic discussion anymore. You can't open a financial newspaper, listen to an economic report, or even just scroll through the news without seeing global debt flagged as critical, urgent.
Yeah, it's front and center.
It's definitely raising alarms globally right now.
Absolutely, and it's with good reason. If you look at the trajectory, recent reports from highly respected institutions like the IMF, the World Bank.
The big players.
Exactly. They're not just mentioning it. They are explicitly ringing alarm bells, calling it a major risk to economic stability.
Wow.
They're highlighting record debt levels, both in absolute terms, trillions of dollars, and as a percentage of global GDP. And this situation carries a very real potential for instability across markets.
So what makes now so particularly urgent? Debt's been growing for a while, hasn't it?
It has. But the game changer, what makes this moment so timely, is the dramatic shift we've seen in interest rates.
Okay.
For well over a decade after the 2008 crisis, rates were historically low. Rock bottom. Borrowing seemed cheap, almost painless.
Right, free money almost.
It felt like it sometimes. But now, central banks everywhere have been aggressively raising rates to fight this persistent inflation we're all experiencing.
And that changes everything for debt.
Completely. This sudden reversal means that debt servicing, just the cost of paying the interest on all that accumulated debt, has become significantly more expensive for governments, for corporations, for individuals.
So that cheap loan suddenly isn't so cheap anymore.
Not at all. And that shift alone has pushed global debt from maybe a background concern into a front-page potential crisis.
So today, our mission for you listening is really to provide a shortcut to getting properly informed on this absolutely critical economic topic. We're going to try and unravel the unprecedented scale of this problem. We'll dive deep into its complex, multi-layered root causes.
Yeah, how we got here.
Exactly. Explore the very tangible ripple effects on everyday citizens like us. Identify the most vulnerable players in this intricate global game.
And then look at solutions.
Right. Potential solutions and, crucially, the inherent risks that come with those solutions.
Because there are always trade-offs.
Always. Our goal is that by the end of this deep dive, you'll not only understand what's really going on behind those alarming headlines, but also have a clearer picture of what it might mean for you. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We keep saying staggering, trillions upon trillions, but just how much debt are we actually talking about? What's the number?
The figures are, frankly, mind-boggling. Recent reports indicate that total global debt combining government, corporate, and household has surpassed an astonishing $300 trillion.
300 trillion! It's hard to even conceptualize that.
It really is. I mean, to put it in some kind of perspective, if you lined up $1 bills end to end, $300 trillion would stretch to the moon and back over 78,000 times.
Wow. Okay, that helps a bit. Or maybe not. It's still immense.
Or, maybe slightly more relatable, If you somehow divided that debt equally among every single person on Earth, man, woman, and child, it would amount to roughly $37,500 per person.
Per person globally. That's staggering.
It is. And what makes it particularly alarming for economists and policymakers isn't just the absolute number, huge as it is. It's the speed and the rate at which this debt has accumulated.
So it's been piling up really fast.
Incredibly fast. Historically, such rapid debt accumulation, especially reaching these kinds of record levels relative to the economy, has often preceded periods of significant economic instability or major financial adjustments.
So it's a warning sign.
It's seen as a major warning sign. It's not just a big number, it's a big number that's growing faster than perhaps ever before.
So if we break down this monumental $300 trillion figure, how does it split between governments, corporations, and households? Is one sector driving this more than others?
Well, it's definitely a collective phenomenon. Each sector has played a really significant, though kind of distinct role in this massive pileup. Let's start with government debt.
Okay, the big one.
Often called the elephant in the room,
Yeah.
Because of its sheer volume and broad implications, this sector has seen a monumental, almost vertical increase in recent years.
And the pandemic was a huge driver there.
The primary driver, absolutely. The unprecedented and frankly necessary fiscal response to COVID-19. Governments globally enacted colossal stimulus packages.
Right, the relief efforts, furlough scheme.
Exactly. Multi-trillion-dollar efforts in the U.S., widespread furlough schemes, direct aid across Europe, everywhere. These measures were crucial. They likely prevented a total economic collapse and widespread social hardship during lockdowns.
But they came at a cost.
An immense cost. They fundamentally ballooned national debts to levels previously unimaginable in peacetime. And beyond the pandemic, you still have ongoing public service costs, healthcare, education, social welfare. These are persistent demands, contributing to a continuous upward trend in government borrowing, especially in developed nations. It's a structural thing, too.
And corporations, they weren't exactly sitting on the sidelines either. What drove their borrowing?
No, definitely not. Corporate debt also contributed significantly, though for different reasons, mainly driven by that long era of ultra-low interest rates after the 2008 crisis.
The cheap money again.
Exactly. Central banks kept borrowing costs artificially low to stimulate recovery. So companies, big public giants and smaller private businesses, they seized the opportunity, borrowed heavily, often at incredibly cheap rates.
For what, mainly? Expansion?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
Genuine expansion, new factories, R&D, mergers and acquisitions to grow market share. That happened. But a significant portion also went into what's often called financial engineering.
Like share buybacks.
Exactly like share buybacks.
Yeah.
Massive share buybacks. Just to quickly explain for listeners, that's when a company uses cash or borrowed money to buy its own stock back from the market.
Which boosts the stock price.
Typically, yes.
Yeah.
Reduces shares outstanding, boosts earnings per share, stock price often follows. Pleases shareholders in the short term, but doesn't necessarily create new productive assets or long-term economic growth.
And the implication now?
The implication now is that many companies are carrying substantial debt burdens. And with interest rates shooting up, that cheap debt is suddenly becoming a real drag on their profits, on their ability to invest, maybe even on their survival if things get rough.
Raises questions about resilience, definitely.
Big questions. How resilient are these highly leveraged companies if economic conditions tighten further, or if we hit a significant downturn?
And then there's the debt that hits closest to home for many of us, the one that impacts our daily lives.
Yeah.
Household debt. Mortgages, credit cards, student loans, that's a huge piece of this too, isn't it?
Precisely. Consumers are also carrying significant burdens, and this connects directly to, well, your direct experience. Mortgages are usually the largest chunk in many countries.
Makes sense.
But credit card debt, student loan debt, they've been steadily climbing, especially in developed economies. And what's become particularly challenging recently is how this debt burden gets worse with inflation. Well, as the cost of living surges, groceries, gas, everything, families might find themselves relying more on credit cards just to cover daily expenses, right? Or maybe drawing down home equity. That, of course, just increases their debt further.
Vicious cycle.
It can be. And just like governments and corporations, households are feeling the sting of rising interest rates. Variable rate mortgages become more expensive month by month. Credit card interest jumps, making it harder to pay down. New borrowing becomes less accessible or just too costly. It's a real squeeze for many families trying to manage budgets.
So we're seeing this mountain of debt piled up across all sectors. But is it evenly spread around the globe? Or are there specific hotspots where it's really concentrated, making some regions more vulnerable than others?
That's a critical point.
Yeah.
It's certainly not evenly distributed. While it's a global phenomenon, we definitely see significant concentrations and, crucially, varying degrees of vulnerability.
Okay.
Generally speaking, developed economies, think North America, Western Europe, Japan, they tend to hold a larger share of the total global debt in absolute dollar terms.
Right, bigger economies, bigger debt numbers.
Exactly. They have larger, more mature financial markets, deeper capital pools, and historically, they've been able to borrow at lower rates because they're seen as stable, good credit risks. Like the US or Japan, huge national debts, but also large, dynamic economies backing them.
But that's not where the biggest risk is, necessarily.
Often not. The real areas of concern, the global hotspots of vulnerability, are frequently found in many emerging markets and developing economies.
Why is that?
Well, while their absolute debt might be smaller than, say, Germany's, it often represents a much higher percentage of their GDP relative to their economic capacity to actually pay it back.
So context matters hugely.
Hugely. A debt-to-GDP ratio of 100% might be manageable for a large, diversified economy like France, but for a smaller nation heavily reliant on maybe one commodity export like copper or oil, that same ratio could be absolutely catastrophic.
And they're more exposed to shocks.
Much more susceptible to external shocks. Things like currency fluctuations. Imagine their local currency suddenly plunging against the US dollar. If they borrowed in dollars, repayment costs explode overnight.
Ouch.
Yeah. Or sudden capital outflows, hot money fleeing the country when international investors get nervous. That can crater their currency and trigger a financial crisis almost instantly.
So why do some regions end up with more debt relative to their size?
It's complex. Factors include the size and maturity of their economies, their historical fiscal policies, they consistently run deficits, and crucially, their access to international capital markets and the terms they get. Can they borrow long-term at fixed rates? Or are they stuck with short-term variable rate debt in foreign currencies?
Which is riskier.
Much riskier. Countries reliant on volatile commodity prices or those with persistent trade deficits often find themselves borrowing more just to bridge gaps, pushing their debt levels towards, well, precarious heights.
Okay, let's unpack this. It feels like we just woke up one day and suddenly the world was swimming in hundreds of trillions of dollars of debt. But it wasn't overnight, was it? How did we arrive at this unprecedented level? What were the key drivers?
No, definitely not overnight. It was more like a slow buildup than a massive acceleration. A perfect storm, really, of powerful economic forces and deliberate policy choices unfolding over more than a decade.
And the starting point often mentioned is the 2008 crisis.
That's the key catalyst, yes. The low interest rate era that began in earnest right after the 2008 global financial crisis. Central banks everywhere, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve, slashed benchmark rates to virtually zero. Some even went negative.
To stimulate the economy, right?
Exactly. A desperate effort to stimulate recovery, fight off deflation. But the consequence was it made borrowing incredibly cheap. And crucially, it created this perception that debt was easily sustainable, almost risk-free.
So everyone jumped in.
Pretty much. Governments found it politically easier and economically, quote-unquote, sensible to finance larger deficits because the interest cost was minimal. Corporations loaded up on leverage for expansion, M&A, those share buybacks we mentioned, because capital is almost free.
And this went on for years.
For over a decade.
Yeah.
It fundamentally altered risk appetites and borrowing habits across the board. The problem, of course, is that cheap debt is now suddenly becoming very expensive to service as rates rise. It's a dramatic, rapid shift, a sort of reckoning for years of easy money.
And then, bam, the pandemic hits. Just as we're in this low-rate world, that must have been an absolute fiscal shockwave.
A massive fiscal shockwave, yes. COVID-19 forced unprecedented, immediate, and truly enormous fiscal responses from governments. They had no choice, really.
Lockdowns, health crises.
Exactly. Widespread lockdowns, economic shutdowns, a global health emergency. Governments had to act decisively to prevent utter collapse. So you got those huge furlough schemes, direct aid to businesses and citizens, expanded unemployment benefits.
And healthcare spending itself.
Exploded. Funding testing, vaccines, supporting overwhelmed hospitals globally. Now, this spending was undeniably necessary. It cushioned the blow, kept societies functioning.
But the debt.
It came at an immense cost. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of national debts, pushing them to levels unimaginable in peacetime. adding a huge new layer right on top of the debt already built up during the low-rate era.
Beyond the pandemic, the world's also felt, well, less stable recently. Geopolitical tensions seem higher. Does that play a role to increase defense spending?
It absolutely does. It's a significant, though maybe less headline-grabbing contributor. In this more volatile, uncertain world, regional conflicts, great power competition, general insecurity, we've seen a noticeable trend of increased defense budgets in many nations.
Right. Countries feel they need to spend more on security.
They do. Investing more in military capabilities, modernizing equipment, strengthening cyber defenses, expanding intelligence, these things cost money. And they directly influence government spending priorities, often adding to national debts.
So instability has a direct financial cost.
A very direct one. Whether it's funding actual conflicts, the ongoing cost of cybersecurity, or just needing larger armed forces in a tense world, these geopolitical realities carry significant financial weight, often requiring borrowing. It's the price tag of trying to secure a less secure world.
What about slower-moving trends like demographics? Many developed countries have aging populations. How does that factor in?
That's a really important, often overlooked long-term pressure. These demographic shifts put steady, increasing pressure on public finances over decades. It's not sudden, but it's relentless.
How did that work exactly?
Well, in many developed nations, people are living longer and birth rates are lower. So you have a larger proportion of the population moving into retirement age, while the relative number of working age people paying taxes is shrinking.
Fewer workers supporting more retirees.
Precisely. A fundamental structural imbalance. This means demand for Social Security, public pensions, and especially healthcare services just keeps rising significantly. That puts immense strain on public budgets.
And governments have to borrow to cover it.
Often, yes. To cover this escalating demand, governments frequently find themselves needing to borrow more. It's like a slow-burning fuse under national debt, requiring very difficult, long-term policy solutions that aren't tied to any single crisis. It's just baked into the demographics now for many countries.
It also feels like climate change is another massive, long-term challenge requiring huge investment.
Is that adding to the debt pile too, creating a sort of necessary debt?
That's a fascinating angle, and it presents a profound dilemma. The need for massive infrastructure and transition investments to fight climate change and shift to greener economies is undeniable, right?
Huge projects, yeah.
Building vast renewable energy grids, climate-resilient infrastructure, transitioning industries away from fossil fuels, defending coastlines, these things require colossal amounts of capital.
And governments have to fund a lot of it. A lot of it, yes. The private sector can't or won't bear the full burden or risk alone for such transformative long-term changes. So governments often need to borrow significantly. It creates this stark choice. Incur substantial debt now for essential climate action, or face potentially far greater economic costs and human suffering from unchecked climate disasters later.
The cost of inaction versus the cost of investment.
Exactly. That calculation is becoming a critical and growing driver in today's debt landscape, pushing governments towards borrowing for what feels like an existential necessity.
And finally, sometimes it's not about global crises or long-term trends. Sometimes it's just governments not managing their money well, right? Is plain old lack of fiscal discipline a factor?
Yes, certainly, we have to acknowledge that. While many factors are external shocks like pandemics or unavoidable trends like aging, it's also undeniably true that in some cases, a fundamental lack of fiscal discipline has significantly contributed.
Spending beyond their means.
Essentially, yes. Not always corruption, though that can happen. Often it's governments consistently spending more than they bring in, without clear long-term plans for revenue or repayment. Structural deficits not tied to crisis response.
Driven by politics sometimes.
Often driven by political expediency or populist policies that promise immediate benefits without considering future costs. Politicians on short electoral cycles might be tempted to borrow for popular programs now, kicking the can down the road, deferring the hard choices of cuts or tax hikes.
So it raises that question.
It raises the important question. How much of this debt is unavoidable necessity from crises, and how much is a direct result of policy choices, governance failures, or just an unwillingness to make politically tough decisions?
And the answer is probably.
The reality is likely a complex, uncomfortable mix of both, which makes the challenge of unwinding this debt even more difficult. It needs profound political will, not just technical solutions.
So we've explored the immense scale and the complex causes. But what does this all mean for us, the everyday person? Who actually pays the price when debt piles up like this? It feels abstract, but it must hit home eventually.
Absolutely. This is exactly where it stops being abstract and starts impacting you directly, often in ways you might not immediately connect to, say, the national debt figures.
Like inflation.
Like inflation.
Okay.
That's probably the most pervasive ripple effect. When governments spend excessively, especially if financed by debt, which often means the central bank effectively printing money to buy government bonds.
Injecting money into the economy?
Right. If the amount of goods and services produced doesn't keep pace with that new money, you get the classic, too much money chasing too few goods. That imbalance is a significant driver of inflationary pressures.
Meaning our money buys less.
Exactly. Your money literally buys less. You see it at the grocery store, the gas pump, everywhere. It's like a hidden tax, silently eroding your purchasing power, making daily life more expensive. That's a direct consequence of how debt can sometimes be managed.
And with central banks fighting that inflation, we've seen interest rates jump dramatically. How does that rapid increase hit people and businesses?
Rising interest rates have a broad, profound impact. It's the main tool central banks use to cool things down. But it makes it significantly more expensive for everyone to borrow new money and to service the debt they already have.
Mortgages, credit cards.
For individuals, higher monthly payments on variable rate mortgages. Owning a home gets much more expensive. Credit card interest charges go up, harder to pay down that debt. For businesses, borrowing for expansion, new equipment, even daily operations becomes costlier.
Which affects investment and hiring?
It certainly can. It hits their profitability, might stifle growth, maybe force cutbacks on hiring or investment plans. And for governments themselves, higher rates mean paying substantially more interest on their bonds.
Which means less money for other things.
Precisely. It diverts a bigger chunk of the national budget away from public services towards just servicing the debt. It's a powerful domino effect, tightening financial conditions everywhere, slowing the economy.
It sounds like heavy government borrowing could actually hurt private businesses too, beyond just the general interest rate effect.
That's exactly right. There's a phenomenon economists call crowding out private investment.
Crowding out.
Yeah. Think of a limited pool of available savings or capital in the financial markets that people are willing to lend. When governments need to borrow heavily, they issue lots of bonds. They're essentially competing directly with private businesses for that same pool of money.
And the government usually wins.
Well, government bonds are often seen as safer, so they can attract capital easily. This increased demand for funds from a huge borrower, the government can push up overall interest rates specifically for private borrowers.
Making it tougher for businesses.
Makes it harder and more expensive for businesses, especially smaller ones, to get loans for their own investments. If they can't get affordable funding, they're less likely to invest, innovate, expand, hire. The long-term effect can be a stifling of economic growth and innovation because the private sector engine gets starved of capital.
And if governments are spending more on interest payments, that directly means less money for public services we rely on, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. That's a very direct and tangible consequence. As debt servicing costs eat up a larger slice of the national budget pie, there's simply less money left for essential public services.
Like healthcare, education.
Exactly. It could mean cuts to healthcare funding, maybe longer wait times, reduced services, less investment in education affecting schools, teachers, resources, deferred spending on critical infrastructure, roads, bridges, public transport, deteriorating.
Things we see and use every day.
Things that directly impact public welfare and quality of life. The services you rely on can become strained, less effective, simply because so much money is going just to pay interest on past borrowing.
We often hear about a country's currency weakening during economic trouble. Is high debt linked to that? And what does a weaker currency mean for us?
It's definitely linked, and it acts like a nation's economic health check. High debt can seriously erode investor confidence. International investors might see a heavily indebted nation as risky, fearing default, instability, maybe policies that devalue their investments.
So they pull their money out.
If confidence wanes, yes. Capital can flow out rapidly, that hot money we mentioned. This selling pressure on the currency makes it weaker.
And a weaker currency means?
Multiple impacts for you. Imports become significantly more expensive, feeding domestic inflation. Think imported electronics, clothes, even food. The country's purchasing power on the global stage drops, and crucially, if the country borrowed in foreign currency, like US dollars.
Which many developing countries do.
Right. A weaker local currency makes repaying that dollar debt much, much harder and more expensive. It can create a dangerous downward spiral of debt and devaluation.
And the worst case scenario lurking behind all this? Actual defaults.
That's the ultimate fear, the specter hanging over highly indebted nations, especially developing ones. The risk of default where a country simply cannot meet its loan payments.
And that's not just that country's problem.
Oh no. It's rarely just an isolated event. It carries immense potential for broader financial contagion. A default by one significant country can trigger panic in global markets. Investors might suddenly pull out of other countries perceived as risky, even if they were okay before.
Like dominoes falling.
Exactly. It can lead to a cascade of defaults or crises across regions, maybe even globally. Think Lehman Brothers in 2008, but on a sovereign scale. It can disrupt trade, freeze investment, cause widespread instability, impacting economies everywhere as credit markets seize up. A truly catastrophic outcome.
And finally, there's a deeper ethical angle here, isn't there? This idea that we're loading up debt today that future generations will have to deal with.
Yes, this raises a really important question of intergenerational equity. It's a profound ethical dilemma. When current generations run up huge debts,
We're essentially sending the bill to the future.
effectively, yes, future generations will bear the burden. They might face higher taxes to pay it off. They might get reduced public services because so much of the budget is tied up in interest payments. Or they might have diminished economic opportunities due to that crowding out effect limiting growth.
It doesn't seem fair.
Well, it implies a fundamental societal choice, doesn't it? Are we unfairly passing on the costs of today's consumption, today's investments, or today's crises to people who had no say in the decisions and might not even benefit? It's a critical long-term societal implication that policymakers need to grapple with the fairness and sustainability of current choices for decades, even centuries ahead. Are we mortgaging our children's future?
So we've painted a pretty sobering picture of the scale, the causes, the impacts. It leads to the big question, what can actually be done? Are there viable paths forward, or are we just stuck? What are the potential solutions, difficult as they might be?
Right, this is where we turn to solutions, and as you say, they're almost always difficult and come with their own challenges. One primary path, especially for governments, is fiscal consolidation.
Balancing the books, basically.
Essentially, yes. Governments needing to bring their budgets back towards balance, or ideally, into surplus to start paying down debt. This usually involves a mix of two things. Substantial spending cuts,
Never popular.
rarely popular, reducing spending on public programs and services, or tax increases, generating more revenue from citizens and businesses, also rarely popular.
So politically, very tough.
Incredibly difficult. Austerity measures, while maybe sound on paper, can be deeply unpopular, especially if they hit essential services or vulnerable groups hard. They can lead to social unrest, political instability. Raising taxes faces huge opposition too. These political realities often make necessary adjustments very hard to implement effectively in democracies.
What about countries really on the edge? Developing nations facing collapse under debt. Is there anything more drastic like restructuring or forgiveness?
Yes, for the most distressed countries, those genuinely teetering on default, debt restructuring, and sometimes even partial debt forgiveness become options.
How does that work?
It's a complex negotiation, usually involving international bodies like the IMF and World Bank, plus creditor nations and private lenders. It happens when a country's debt is clearly unsustainable. They simply cannot pay without collapsing their economy.
So what does restructuring look like?
It might mean extending repayment periods, giving them more years to pay, reducing interest rates on existing loans, or, in some cases, actual forgiveness, where a portion of the debt is simply written off.
A lifeline, essentially.
It's meant as a lifeline, yeah. A chance to regain stability and maybe achieve some growth. But it almost always comes with strings attached, strict conditions for economic reform, austerity measures, structural adjustments. These can be politically painful for the debtor nation and its citizens in the short term.
It seems the ideal way out would be just to grow the economy faster than the debt. If GDP grows quickly, the debt shrinks relative to the economy, right? Is that achievable?
Conceptually, yes. That's what most economists would say is the ultimate least painful solution. Robust economic growth. If your economy grows faster than your debt pile.
The ratio improves automatically.
Exactly. The relative burden decreases over time. Strong growth generates more tax revenue, making debt easier to service, creates jobs, improves living standards. It's the rising tide lifting all boats, including the government's fiscal position.
But it's not that easy.
Well, the challenge is how to achieve that kind of robust, sustained growth in the current global environment. We have geopolitical instability, trade tensions, slowing productivity growth in many places. Achieving high, consistent growth is incredibly difficult. Relying solely on growth to solve a deep debt crisis is often wishful thinking, because that growth just isn't guaranteed. It can be very elusive.
Central banks play a critical role here, too, with interest rates and monetary policy. It feels like they're walking a very fine line.
They absolutely are. It's an incredibly delicate, often perilous tightrope walk. Through responsible monetary policy, they're trying to control inflation without crashing the economy or triggering a debt crisis.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Somewhat, yes. To curb inflation, they usually need to raise rates, make borrowing more expensive, cool things down. But raise rates too much or too fast, and you risk pushing highly indebted governments, companies, or households over the edge into default. That could trigger recession or a financial crisis.
So it's a constant balancing act.
A continuous high-stakes trade-off between price stability, fighting inflation, and financial stability, preventing defaults and collapse. Their decisions require incredibly fine judgment and are always under intense scrutiny.
And given this is a global problem, crossing borders, surely solutions need to be global too. How important is international cooperation?
Critically important. You've hit on a key point. A global problem fundamentally requires global solutions and strong international cooperation. A debt default in one country, especially a big one, can have devastating ripple effects everywhere.
So going it alone won't work.
A fragmented approach, where every country just looks out for itself, simply won't cut it for an issue this interconnected through global finance. Cooperation could mean coordinated fiscal policies among major economies, joint debt relief efforts for poorer nations, shared standards for lending, better communication between central banks.
But that requires trust and compromise.
It demands unprecedented levels of collaboration and a willingness for nations to sometimes put collective global stability ahead of narrow, short-term national interests. Very challenging, but arguably essential. Without it, the problem likely just gets worse.
Looking longer term, is there any hope from technology? Can innovation and productivity gains help us grow our way out of this hole eventually?
That's an interesting and more hopeful angle. Can technological advancements and innovation boost the economy enough to manage this debt? Yes, potentially. They can be a powerful long-term strategy. By increasing efficiency across industries, creating entirely new markets, boosting overall productivity and economic output, innovation can help lift growth rates. If economies grow faster, debt burdens become more manageable over time.
Examples.
Think about digital transformation, streamlining government services, making them cheaper, breakthroughs in green energy, reducing reliance on volatile fossil fuels, boosting energy security and potentially growth. AI improving productivity. The potential is definitely there.
But it's not automatic.
No, it requires sustained investment in R&D, in education for a skilled workforce, and creating regulatory environments that actually encourage innovation and entrepreneurship. It's not a magic bullet for the current debt overhang, but it's a vital part of the long-term picture for economic health.
So we've run through several potential solutions: fiscal consolidation, restructuring, growth, cooperation, innovation. But it sounds like every single one has significant risks or downsides attached.
That's the really tough part, the crucial crux of it. Every proposed remedial action, however necessary, carries its own set of potential pitfalls and unintended consequences.
Like austerity causing unrest.
Exactly. Austerity, if too harsh or badly designed, can trigger severe social unrest and political instability, potentially making things worse, not better. Defaults, as we said, risk market panic and global contagion.
Even things like trade wars.
Right. Actions taken perhaps to boost national growth, like trade wars or heavy protectionism, can inadvertently disrupt global supply chains, harm international relations, and actually exacerbate economic instability, making debt problems harder to solve for everyone.
So no easy answers.
No easy answers, no painless fixes. It highlights that well-intentioned solutions can have unforeseen negative repercussions. Policymaking requires incredibly careful consideration of these trade-offs, a very nuanced approach, trying to mitigate those risks as much as possible.
Well, this deep dive has definitely shown us that global debt isn't just some abstract number. It's a profoundly complex, incredibly pressing issue with, as you said, no easy answers at all. It's something woven into our daily lives, influencing government choices, and directly impacting the future stability of the entire global economy.
Absolutely. And I think connecting it all together, the sheer scale, the complex causes, those far-reaching ripple effects across society, it really underscores the urgent need for, well, informed public discussion about this, and for proactive, even if difficult, policy measures. Understanding these dynamics is just crucial for navigating what's ahead.
So we leave you with this thought. What do you think is the single biggest threat posed by this unprecedented level of global debt? And perhaps more importantly, reflecting on everything we've discussed, what steps do you believe should be taken to address it? We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning about this vital topic, because how we handle this will undoubtedly shape the world for generations to come.